Welcome to Virginia U.S. History Standard 3C. Today we will explain the impact of the development of something called indentured servitude, as well as slavery in the colonies. Our essential understanding for the standard: American colonial reliance. Reliance is a need for or dependence on a cheap enslaved labor force conflicted, fought with, or contradicted the founding principles established in the Declaration of Independence. When we think of Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers and the words that they put on paper, we see there on the graphic, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that those ideas on paper were really incompatible with the institution of slavery, of having people enslaved, that you couldn't have people bought and sold and agreed to all men are created equal, that you couldn't exploit the labor of other human beings and talk about pursuit of happiness, the physical beating and the use of people for economic gain and economic profit, that those ideas just didn't go along with the words of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so our essential knowledge, what we want to get from this recording, is to know the following details about the development of indentured servitude and slavery during the colonial period. Our first point to understand is that all American colonies adopted African slavery as their primary source of free labor. Uh, I think some people might not be aware of that. The people are aware, especially in the southern colonies, but the idea that all the colonies, as we see on the map here, next to the name of each colony is the number of slaves. I forget which year we're looking at here, but at this given point in time, the number of slaves in the colony, and then the color indicates the percentage of the population that was made up of people who were slaves. Okay, so we see ranging from a low number of people in New Hampshire to a much higher number in Virginia. Okay, and we also see the shading there indicating the percentage of the population made up by people who were slaves. And we even see in New York City back in the 1700s, down around what's now Wall Street. Okay, there was one of the biggest slave markets in the colonies. So the idea that slavery was established and part of all of the colonies. However, the southern colonies are really where slavery becomes most established. It was the growth of a plantation-based agricultural economy. In these colonies down here, we can really see the effect of slavery there in the shading. We see above the red circle there, most of the states really, with the exception of New York, the population of slaves was on 10% and under of the population. But we see in colonies like Georgia, South Carolina, where slaves made up over 60% of the population. In these hot, humid coastal lowlands of these colonies, a cheap labor source was required to farm on the large scale that developed there. You just had a different kind of agriculture develop in these colonies. We see here on these maps, a lot of it had to do with geography. We can see the map on the left, the quality of soil. The soil wasn't as good up in New England. Okay, the lighter the shading, the least fertile Okay, the less good the soil was, the darker the green, those were the good farming areas. And we see those were predominantly in the southern colonies. In the map on the right, we see the length of the growing season. You have this big disparity between the northern colonies and the southern colonies, more than twice the length of the growing season. A farmer had twice as much time to harvest the plant and harvest their crops and make a profit in the southern colonies than they did in the New England colonies, some of which only had, a quarter to less than a half the year of productive agriculture. Okay, and so you saw in the southern colonies the development of these plantations, these huge, massive farms of hundreds and thousands of acres, in some cases, of fields, of crops, of livestock, huge amounts of land that required a very large labor force. Again, this is in no way morally justifying the use of slave labor, but from an economic standpoint, okay, this was the justification that these huge pieces of land required far more people than any one family themselves could provide. And that's where we see the large scale use of enslaved labor is in these the coastal regions of the middle and southern colonies. Okay, we see also another form of labor here for some labor needs, and in particular in Virginia, and particularly early on in the colonial period. Indentured servants filled some of the labor needs. Indentured servants were poor Europeans. Um, they agreed to work on the plantations as laborers for a set period of time in return for the plantation owner paying their passage on the boats from Europe. In other words, in exchange for a ticket to get out of Europe and get to the American colonies, poor Europeans from England, from Ireland, from Scotland, mainly the British Isles, to the British colonies in the Americas, they were willing to give up their freedom for a set period, usually about 7 years, to do labor on a farm here in the Americas. Okay, the two important distinctions here about indentured servitude was that this was Europeans. This wasn't really an option open to African laborers. And the more important thing here is it was limited in time. That the picture of these indentured servants here, once their time was done, once their 7 years or whatever the agreed upon time was, they were then free to go on and pursue their own lives in freedom. Their children weren't going to be raised as indentured servants. They would then be free. This African slave didn't have that same opportunity. Okay, the indentured servant had a legal document, as we see here, that set out the requirements and the expectations of their work and the length of time that they were bound to this plantation, after which they were then free to begin their own lives. Over time, though, indentured servitude really starts to become less of a source of labor on the plantations, and a larger number of enslaved Africans are forcibly taken from their homes in Africa and brought across the Atlantic Ocean in what's known as the Middle Passage. Okay, and this was the trip across the Atlantic Ocean by boat from Africa to the Americas. We can see here this is just one example here in Virginia, in York County in the second half of the 1600s. We can kind of see by the later part of the 1600s a very steep decline in the blue line, the use of indentured servants, and a very steep rise in the use of slaves. And we would have seen similar patterns repeated throughout Virginia and the colonies. slave labor where you own the person. Uh, you could sell the person, you could transfer them on, in wills and legal documents to other members of the family. That began to outnumber uh, indentured servants who had much more legal rights. Okay, the Middle Passage refers again to that trip across the Atlantic Ocean and just the horrendous, inhumane conditions in which human beings, like we said, kidnapped from their homes, packed in the hulls of ships, okay, sent across the Atlantic Ocean. Um, the Atlantic Ocean has many nicknames, one of which is the world's largest graveyard. Again, a slave on a slave ship coming across the Middle Passage, from a purely economic standpoint, they were a product. Okay, and that's sort of the tragedy and the inhumanity of it. That just the same as a defective product, gets tossed aside. A slave who became sick or somehow, not able to do labor, oftentimes would have just been thrown over the side of the boat. So just kind of the horrendous conditions here involved in the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, and noticing our number here is wrong. This should be number 5 on our sheet here. Okay, last thing for this is the development of a slavery-based economic system in the southern colonies. This reliance and dependence on slave labor that only grew as the 1700s into the 1800s progressed. It led to a deepening divide between the northern states that became less dependent on slave labor and the southern states who became more. And that divide eventually led to conflict between the North and the South. Okay, on our map here, the pinkish reddish states and the light green states, the free states and the slave states, it led to the American Civil War. We'll get to the Civil War later on in the course, but it's just it is just a cloud that kind of hangs over American history, that the legacy of slavery. It's just been like we said, it's a cloud that really affects so much of our history, and one that even to the present day. Um, I just think in general, the more open and honest we can be in discussing the effects and the legacies of this, the better society will be. But I just don't think we've ever quite fully dealt with the long-term effects and the divisions and the divides that slavery has kind of left a legacy of here in the United States. And that's what we will leave off here for Standard 3C.